Hi, everybody. So we're now moving into chapter 4, which is really the heart of this text and of this course on reasoning and critical thinking. Back in chapter 3, we were given a set of tools for recognizing reasoning in written texts, along with a method for schematizing or diagramming those arguments. As we move now into chapter 4, we're going to be focusing on the analysis of arguments. We'll be looking at the parts that make up an argument and how arguments and reasoning work. The tools that we'll look at in chapter 4 will allow us to do a number of things. First, they will help us to identify and understand reasoning. This goes beyond just recognizing the support and the conclusion, but really understanding what the argument is accomplishing and being able to communicate that understanding to others. These tools will help us to evaluate reasoning. That's one of the things we care about when it comes to arguments, not just understanding them, but evaluating them. Is an argument good or bad, strong or weak, and why? We'll be able to say some things about that. Number 3, these tools will help us to improve reasoning. So sometimes we're evaluating reasoning that is presented to us, but in other cases, we are the ones presenting reasoning. And so we will want our arguments to be as strong as possible. And these tools will help us to know what to look for. Finally, the tools of this chapter will help us to identify sources of disagreement. So often enough, when arguments are being presented, not everybody is going to be convinced. Not everybody is going to be persuaded. And it's important to be able to figure out why. Why are we not agreeing? Now, as a matter of fact, we are engaged in these kinds of activities all the time. We're hearing arguments and understanding them without any problem. We're evaluating arguments. We are putting together our own arguments, trying to make them as strong as possible. And when we get into disagreements with others, we can often have fruitful conversations and uncover the differences between how I'm viewing the argument and how another person is viewing an argument. We're actually very good at this. But there are contexts and situations where our natural skill level when it comes to handling arguments may not be enough. And that's where it's especially helpful to have some tools, some vocabulary, and some ways of talking about what makes arguments work. So let's move forward by looking at that question: what makes arguments work? Or another way of thinking about this: what distinguishes something that is an argument from something that is not an argument? So if you look at the screen, I have some sets of sentences, and one of these is an argument, and the other is not. Now, that's probably pretty obvious here, and even if we look at this next example, it's pretty clear how one is an argument and one is not. And even as we move into this next example, pause the video and take a moment to look at these different examples. In this case, one of these sets of sentences is an argument and one of them is not. So what's the difference? Well, the difference has to do with context and motivation. And what we want to understand is that there's more to an argument than just the sentences that make up the support and the conclusion. The point here is similar to a point we raised back in chapter 1. There we made the point that the meaning of a sentence or the meaning of a statement depends on more than the dictionary definitions of the words. So take a simple sentence like, "The cat is on the mat." Depending on the context, that one sentence, the exact same words, could mean two radically different things. And so in order to understand a statement, you have to go beyond the dictionary definition to understand the context. The same is true of arguments. In order to understand an argument, you have to go beyond just the sentences that are written down or that are expressed, and you need to pay attention to the context, the motivation, or what our text will sometimes refer to as the internal structure. We don't usually appreciate the important role that context plays in understanding an argument. until we're in a situation where we're talking to someone who has a very different background or a different understanding of the context. We don't have a natural vocabulary for talking about it. So that's what our text is providing for us. Chapter 4 is giving us a set of tools and vocabulary for talking about the internal structure of an argument. By the end of chapter 4, we'll have 6 different tools that we can use to talk about the internal structure of an argument. And when we bring them all together, they form a complete argument. Like pieces of a puzzle, when all of them are fitted together, we'll have a complete picture of the argument. And if any one of these ingredients does not fit, that will be an indication that we haven't yet understood the argument completely. So we're already somewhat familiar with support and conclusions, and we know how to identify those in written texts or when arguments are presented. So we'll start by looking at implicit questions. Implicit questions are a way of capturing the motivation that gives meaning to an argument. So arguments are not these things that just float out there in the world. We give arguments or put together arguments with a particular goal in mind. And the way we're going to view arguments in this class is arguments aim at answering questions. So a key part of understanding an argument is understanding the question that that argument is trying to answer. Now, this is probably something you've run into already in your ordinary life. So look at this example on the screen. We imagine different parties in a business having a disagreement about what strategy to use. One side says we should use strategy A for a certain set of reasons. The other side says we should use strategy B for a different set of reasons. But what happens if we look at the questions that each side is trying to answer? Suppose that party A is trying to figure out what is the best strategy from a financial perspective, and party B is trying to figure out what is the best strategy from a marketing perspective. Suddenly, having pointed out the questions that they're trying to answer, our view of these arguments changes. It might have looked at first like they were disagreeing with one another, but now it might not look like they're disagreeing at all. Our understanding of their arguments was clarified when we understood the question that they were trying to answer. Here's just another example. Again, if we're talking about goals in a business, and one side says we should try to accomplish X, and the other side says we should try to accomplish Y, these look like conflicting recommendations. And yet, if they're each trying to answer different questions, what should be our goal for the first quarter? What should be our goal for the entire year? We can see how it might turn out they're not disagreeing at all. And you've probably run into situations like this in your life as well. This then is how we're going to view and treat all the arguments that we're going to look at. The purpose of an argument is to find the best answer to some question. And an argument is good if it accomplishes this goal. Notice that this way of viewing arguments is different from another way of viewing arguments where the goal and the focus is persuasion. The purpose of an argument is to convince someone to agree with you. But notice, you can persuade someone of something that is true, or you can persuade someone of something that is false. You may be equally persuasive in either case. But when it comes to reasoning, our reasoning is only effective if it actually leads us to what is true or correct. If we're trying to solve a problem and thinking through it carefully, our goal is to get at the right answer, not just an answer that is persuasive. So reasoning and persuasion are different. Talk of arguments comes up in both of these, but we are going to be focusing on arguments in their connection with reasoning, where the purpose of an argument is to find the best answer to some question. And identifying the question that fits with a particular argument is the first step in getting really clear on understanding the argument. All right, as we move through chapter 4 and get introduced to these different tools, it will help for us to work with a particular example. So take a look at this passage. From Washington, Secret Service officials suggested Monday that a dramatic suicide rather than an assassination attempt was the most likely motivation behind the crash on the White House South Lawn of a light plane piloted by Frank Corder. This passage appears on page 114 of your textbook. We'll refer to it over and over in this video. It'll be our main example. So take a moment to read through that passage. Now, if we think back to the reasoning clues from chapter 3, we can notice several different places where reasoning clues show up. So the words suggested, most likely, appear, and conclusion indicate to us that reasoning is being presented in this passage. The author is not trying to put together an argument to convince the reader of anything. This isn't like a letter to the editor, but we are still being presented with reasoning that the investigators and Secret Service officials engaged in. We're being presented with their conclusion and the support for that conclusion, that Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically. Now, as we work on articulating our understanding of the Secret Service official's argument, we want to go ahead and state what the implicit question is. What is the question that the Secret Service officials are trying to answer? The question is, why did Corder crash his plane into the White House lawn? That's what the Secret Service officials were trying to figure out, and the conclusion of the argument is the answer to that question. Now, there are lots of other parts that go to making up an argument, but when the conclusion and the implicit question fit, that's our first clue that we're on the right track for understanding the argument. Now, in this example, identifying the implicit question might seem very simple, but there are going to be cases that are more challenging, so take time to think about how this works. We're now working through material that is covered in pages 146 and 147 of your textbook. So make sure that you're consulting the textbook and doing those exercises along with watching these videos. Now, we've started with these two ingredients, the conclusion and the implicit question. But those are not enough to provide a complete analysis or complete understanding of an argument. That point might seem pretty obvious, but it can also be highlighted by pointing out that for any conclusion, there are going to be several implicit questions that would be compatible with that conclusion. Why did Corder crash his plane into the White House lawn is one question that the conclusion answers, but the question, in what way did Corder want to kill himself, is also answered by the conclusion. Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically. And when we set these two questions and conclusions side by side, we can see the beginnings of two different interpretations of the argument. Now, one of these interpretations, analyses, is correct and the other is not correct. And it's fairly obvious in this case which is correct. But again, in some more complicated passages, when dealing with more complicated arguments, it may not be so easy. How do we decide which one is correct? Well, we need to bring in more of the ingredients. So the next ingredient that we can bring in is the support. Here are a couple pieces of support that appear in this passage. He had no grievances against President Clinton, and there were no explosives aboard the plane. Now, the purpose of support in an argument is to help guide us toward the correct answer to the implicit question. Now, if we look at the first interpretation on the left-hand side of the screen, the question is, why did Corder crash his plane into the White House lawn? And notice that facts about Corder's attitude toward President Clinton and the fact that there were no explosives aboard his plane point toward the conclusion as a good answer to the implicit question. There's a fit between the support and the conclusion. The support helps to make sense of the conclusion. The same doesn't hold for the right-hand interpretation. According to the right-hand interpretation, the investigators are trying to figure out in what way did Corder want to kill himself. And their evidence is he had no grievances against President Clinton, there were no explosives aboard the plane, so they concluded that Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically. That's the way he wanted to kill himself. And remember, When the different parts don't fit, that's what lets us know that the right-hand interpretation is not understanding the Secret Service official's argument correctly. There's one more ingredient or component that we can use to round out our interpretation of an argument to show that we understand it, and that is rival conclusions. So, for any given question, why did Corder crash his plane into the White House lawn? In what way did Corder want to kill himself? There are going to be several possible answers, and the purpose of an argument is to show which one of those answers is the best one. And one way we can show that we understand the argument is by stating what some of those other possible answers are. So, if the question is, why did Corder crash his plane into the White House lawn? We understand that the different possible answers include things like wanting to kill himself dramatically and wanting to assassinate the president. And by being able to state what those rivals are, we show that we understand the meaning of the argument. In the same way, if the question is, in what way did Corder want to kill himself? Possible answers are going to be things like he wanted to kill himself dramatically, or he wanted to kill himself discreetly. Now, as we look at the interpretations here on the screen, by adding the rival conclusions to each of the interpretations, we make even clearer the fact that the left-hand interpretation is correct and the right-hand interpretation is not. According to the right-hand interpretation, the investigators are trying to figure out in what way did Corder want to kill himself. Possible answers include wanting to kill himself dramatically or wanting to kill himself discreetly, and support like him not having grievances against President Clinton and there being no explosives aboard the plane are supposed to show that Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically instead of discreetly. Now, if that didn't make sense, that's because it doesn't make sense. That interpretation does not fit what the investigators in the original passage were trying to do. On the other hand, the ingredients in the left-hand interpretation do fit together. The implicit question, the conclusion, the support, and the rivals all fit together. And that's what lets us know that that is the correct interpretation of the Secret Service investigators' reasoning. With all these ingredients, then, we have a way of talking about the purpose of arguments and what makes arguments work. And we can talk about this in general or as it applies to a particular argument. So the purpose of an argument or the purpose of reasoning is to uncover the best answer to some question. Anytime we ask a question, notice there will be lots of possible answers, or what we'll call rivals. And the purpose of the support, then, in the argument is to show which answer is the best answer. And whichever answer is the best answer, that's what we call the conclusion. So then on page 149, we get this basic articulation of what an argument accomplishes. When someone puts forward an argument, provides a bunch of support and a conclusion, the support recommends the conclusion as the right answer to give the argument's implicit question. The support shows that this conclusion is a better answer than the conclusion's natural rivals. Just a couple more points to make. Two people understand an argument in the same way if they agree about what question is being answered and what rivals are alternatives to the conclusion. If you can get two people who are evaluating an argument to agree on what the question is and agree on what the rivals are, then it's pretty clear they understand the argument in the same way. And you can show that you understand an argument by identifying its implicit question, giving a sample of the rivals, all in addition to identifying the conclusion and the support. And this is part of what you'll be doing on upcoming quizzes. You'll be presented with arguments in written texts, and you'll need to show that you understand the argument by identifying what is the implicit question and what are the rivals, in addition to identifying the conclusion and the support. At this point, we've been introduced to 4 of the 6 tools that are the focus here. But before moving on to the ranking of rivals and the relevance of support, our text takes several pages to just focus on rival conclusions. From page 150 to 169, the text works on refining this particular tool. And rival conclusions really are extremely powerful and useful as tools for understanding arguments and reasoning. We don't have time to go through all of the different details in these videos, but I'll highlight some of the main points, and you should go through the text and the exercises in order to understand fully how to use these tools. So rivals do a number of different jobs. Number one, rivals help us to clarify the meaning or significance of the conclusion. Understanding what is not the conclusion actually helps us to better understand what the conclusion is. Rivals group possible answers to the implicit question together based on important and interesting differences, so they refine our understanding of the space of possible answers. Rivals also help to clarify the meaning of the implicit question, and we'll see an example of that in just a moment. In order for rivals to perform all these functions, there are going to be some restrictions or requirements on rivals. So the basic idea of a rival is just a possible answer to the implicit question. But for any given question, there are going to be a virtually unlimited number of possible answers. And just picking any random sample of answers is not going to be very helpful for showing your understanding. So when you're coming up with your list of rivals on quizzes, for instance, and exercises, keep these points in mind. Your rivals should answer the implicit question. Make sure that any rivals you come up with answer the implicit question. Number two, your rivals should be incompatible with the conclusion. So if the conclusion is true, then your rival should be false. If your rival is true, then your conclusion should be false. They should not be overlapping. Your rivals should not overlap with the conclusion, and they should also not overlap with each other. So they should be mutually exclusive. And look at the exercises for examples of this. And finally, natural rivals should capture the contrast that is rejected by the conclusion. So when you're coming up with a list of natural rivals, you should focus in most cases on the kinds of things that the author might have in mind or that the Secret Service officials might have in mind. Now, for one example of how rivals help us to clarify the meaning of an implicit question, let's look at this example. Here again, we're looking at the article about Frank Corder crashing his plane into the White House lawn. I've got 2 different possible interpretations here, or the beginnings of 2 possible interpretations here. We're working with the same implicit question, but we've got different sets of rivals in each case. In the left-hand side, possible answers to the implicit question include things like Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically. Corder wanted to assassinate the president. Corder was an eccentric artist and crashed as a part of a performance art piece. Okay, that last possibility is a little far-fetched, but it is an answer to the implicit question, and it is incompatible with the conclusion and mutually exclusive with the other rivals. Now compare this set of rivals, this set of possible answers with the right-hand interpretation. Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically, that stays the same, but then the other rivals, Corder got confused and crashed accidentally. Corder's plane ran out of fuel. Now, even though the implicit question is phrased the same way, the different sets of rivals suggest that the question is being interpreted in slightly different ways. Notice that the left-hand rivals all have to do with motives for crashing the plane into the White House lawn. The motive of wanting to kill himself, the motive of wanting to assassinate the president, or the motive of doing a performance art piece. Whereas on the right-hand side, those rivals don't have to do with motives. They have to do with causes. Maybe he intentionally crashed his plane, or maybe he did so accidentally. as a result of confusion or by running out of gas. And now, when we clarify the question in this way, then we want to ask ourselves, okay, which one of these is a better interpretation of what's going on in the original passage? And if you go back to the original passage, you'll see that there are references to motives. The investigators were trying to figure out why Corder intentionally crashed his plane into the White House lawn. And that means that the left hand interpretation with the left hand set of rivals is a better interpretation of the argument than the right hand one. The left hand set of rivals is a better set of rivals for fitting this article than the right hand set of rivals. One of the other requirements that was mentioned was that rivals should be natural, should capture the contrast that is rejected by the conclusion. So take a look at these possible answers to the implicit question. Corder got drunk and wanted to kill himself. Corder was sober and wanted to kill himself. Corder wanted to kill himself but had last-minute regrets. Corder wanted to kill himself but had no last-minute regrets. Now notice these are all possible answers to the implicit question. They are all stories or shorthand for stories of why Corder crashed his plane into the White House lawn. But again, if you're coming up with a list of rivals on a quiz, you wouldn't want to use these as your list because these are all much too close together. They don't provide enough of a contrast to show understanding. If we look at a different set of rivals, Corder wanted to assassinate the president, Corder was trying to land as part of a dare, Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically. Notice how R3, 4, 5, and 6 all fit into that one category. And so this set of rivals is much better. R1, R2, and C. Starting on page 159, we get a few more refinements of the rivals as a tool. We'll see as we move into the next section that rivals help us to evaluate the strength of an argument. So far, we've just been focusing on understanding arguments, but we'll move on to talk about evaluating arguments, and rivals will be very helpful there. Rivals also help us to think more deeply about the argument's topic and the implicit question. And so 2 more requirements for rivals to keep in mind. Avoid yes-no questions and rivals. So avoid implicit questions where the only possible answers are yes and no. Those sorts of questions, those sorts of rivals are generally unhelpful for developing real thoughtful critical thinking. And then another requirement, make sure that your rivals are consistent with the support. And again, we'll talk more about that as we get into evaluating arguments. The purpose of an argument is to pick which one of the possible answers is the best answer to the implicit question. So when you come up with a list of rivals, it should be consistent with the support that you have gathered at that point. All right, read those pages in the text because they go into much more detail about it. This is just a really quick summary. And then we'll move on to the next section of our video.